Yeah, good afternoon again. So I'm going to talk very briefly. I think today's opportunity for an hour is more to learn and hear from our panelists here in terms of what they're doing in relation to co-creating investment platforms. But before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about GCF and about GCF and what we do at a glance. So we're the largest multilateral fund dedicated to climate impact and drive paradigm shift and transformative changes in climate action. We're a hub of, which is very important, we're a hub of climate finance for co-investment platforms. We help to de-risk private sector projects to address urgent needs for countries most at risk to climate impact. And with our partners, we're putting forward investment initiatives and platforms to accelerate climate innovation and investment at scale. Very quickly, in terms of what we've done, in disbursement, we've disbursed about $3 billion up to this year, 2022, and in implementation about $9 billion. March this year, and for our B32, the private sector strategy was approved. That was instrumental for us because GCF is a public institution, but we know that the size of the problem in terms of climate impact demands that the private sector is engaged, and the private sector strategy was developed in order to encourage us to have a pathway that we could help to engage with the private sector and help to catalyze more funding away, not just from the public purse, i.e. government, we know what's going on in that area, but also in terms of the private sector. We know roughly at the moment there are about 95 to 100 trillion dollars worth of assets under management with the private sector, insurance companies, pension funds, asset management companies, etc. But less than 2 to 3% of that has been channeled towards impact and climate. The idea is to see how we can help to catalyze, have a pathway that it helps to basically access some of that funding and to make the climate goals and climate impact part of the normal kind of operations for financial institutions, etc. So that is key for us. And we do that in terms of our core pillars. The idea is to help to de-risk projects at an early stage. So we do that using equity. We help to catalyze funding from the private sector. We look at innovation, especially in relation to helping to green financial institutions. And also we consider what we call the paradigm shift. So we're not doing projects one by one. We're looking at doing projects at scale, help to address the climate impact that we face. So we do that through a number of instruments. Historically, we've funded that through debt. If you look at our portfolio is roughly about 80 to 82% debt and grants. But over the last few years, we're now looking at doing more equity as well as guarantees. Why? As I said before, we know that there's not just from a macro perspective, but the idea is to do more with what we have. We're finite in terms of the funding that we address, but that we have, sorry, but we want to leverage. It's absolutely key for us to leverage and mobilize additional funding from the private sector, as I indicated, and we do that through providing equity as well as guarantees, etc. Oh. Okay. Yes. So I know that whilst we are implementation and partnership organization, we are also a learning organization, and it's important that through our panel today that we engage with our partners and we learn from our partners in terms of how best to do the work that we were created to do. We know that there's room for improvement, and I think this opportunity allows us to hear from our partners what they're doing and how they're doing it and what we can do better. So the first panelist is Abdullah Albiri, Chief Investment Officer for the Sovereign Fund of Egypt. Next, Peslin Gilbert Stoney, Senior Manager, Legal and Governance, Jamaica Social Investment Fund. Third, Jacqueline Novogratz, CEO in the Acumen Fund. Welcome. Fourth, Christopher Marks, Head of Emerging Markets in the MUFG. And last but not least, Mark Dooley, Head of Green Investments Group, Macquarie Group. So it's great to have you with us here. So I'll pass on to Abdullah, who will make a short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. There's been a lot of technology hitches with the presentations. So, I'll just get used to the mic and give a short introduction. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. We, as the Sovereign Fund of Egypt, we're a relatively young organization. So we're about 3 years old. Our CEO was hired 3 years ago. So we started with a problem being identified already. We have a crisis. We all believe we have a crisis. And everything we need to do to invest needs to be a solution to the crisis. Whether we are in infrastructure, utilities, healthcare, and banking or non-banking financial services, repurposing real estate assets, it all needs to have a green element, right? We need to really work together to save the world. So I want to take a few sound bites from my friend's words, a learning organization. So 3 years ago, we didn't know much about green hydrogen. We didn't know much about desalination or repurposing of green buildings, et cetera. But we're learning as we go along. And yesterday, we announced the launch of our first project of a 100 megawatt electrolyzer of green hydrogen. I think this is the largest scale green hydrogen project on the African continent. And as Egypt hosts COP27 on behalf of Africa, we're glad to showcase a project that is on African soil, that is cutting edge, that is a key to demonstrate how green hydrogen can and will save the world. How can we make it grow? How can we make it big? How can we participate? Now there's a very important saying that it says it takes a village to raise a child. Now, hydrogen is that infant industry, and we all need to make it happen. No one can do it on himself. No one can do it by himself. So it's not the developers that can do it. It's not the DFIs that can do it. It's not the sovereign funds that can do it. It's not the environmentalists that can do it. It's everyone together. So we all need to work together, put our heads together, put our thoughts together, put our money together, and put our learnings together to make it happen. So we want to play a key leadership role in making it happen. Our friends to my right and to my left, they're all key participants, and we need to all come together. So that's one key thought. The second key thought is a lot of learning that happened as we took on that journey. Let me give you one. We started thinking about repurposing buildings. Everybody knew about LEED certification, for example. So is it LEED Gold? Is it LEED Platinum? How can we save electricity? Is it a zero carbon building? Okay, these were all good. And then I called well certified. Because people living in these buildings need to live well, and that's a certification. So when you take care of the environment, LEED certified, you also need to make sure that the humans taken care of, well certified. So we are stewards of the globe. We are stewards of economies, and we need to start acting as such. Now, one of the interesting sound bites that I heard during that conference is there's a lot of gigabytes of talk and net zero action. Well, I hope that with talks, we go out of COP geared towards action, making sure that we have something measurable to talk about. Yesterday, when we launched our hydrogen first project in Africa, it was all about action. It was not about, this could happen in a year. We wanted to show that this is happening now. And we want to encourage everyone to showcase execution on the ground, because it's all management by objectives. So, we need to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. So, as you heard, I'm from Jamaica. And as I look at the topic, I realize we're speaking about scaling up. And I'm looking at scaling up in Jamaica is looking at scaling up not only in terms of size, but in terms of collaboration with other entities, with other countries of the region, and certainly a broad-based approach to climate action. So Jamaica's initiative basically comes from a broad-based approach where we, through the Green Climate Fund, seeking to get accreditation for 3 entities, and one being Jamaica Social Investment Fund, and we were recently accredited March of this year. And we will be doing community-based intervention at scale as well. And we will, the other 2 entities, one will be looking at the private sector and the other will be looking at public sector investments. So the scaling is not just one aspect of it. We are trying to tackle it from different perspectives. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of looking at it and the approach to the climate action. We are also looking at scaling from a regional perspective, and we share similar problems in the region. And so we thought it important to ensure that some of the lessons learned from the projects are scaled and are also shared and learned by us. So I'm just going to share about 2 or 3 activities that we are looking at in terms of scaling on a regional level. One of them was mobilizing private sector to support low carbon and climate resilient development in Jamaica and the other CARICOM states. And the aim of this was a readiness grant. It was to investigate barriers to private sector investments at the national and regional level, and to support the accreditation of the selected private sector entities. Okay, so that's one that is looking from the private sector. And as my partners just said on the platform, private sector is crucial to this fight. The other thing that we're looking at is looking at a Caribbean green bond listing on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. And with this, we will assess the debt market and foster a conducive environment for a green bond market through building a green bond market ecosystem. And it has been done in partnership with the Jamaica Stock Exchange and Dominica. It is anticipated that this green bond will raise funds in Jamaica on Jamaica's and regional debt markets to finance environmentally sustainable activities. And it is likely to cover energy efficiency, clean transportation, pollution prevention, sustainable agriculture, fisheries, etc. So that's one that is more in terms of the regional. The other activity, I would say, when we're looking at climate change, because it affects us in different ways, we're looking at a gender-based approach as well. Okay, so what we have done is that we have facilitating a gender-responsive approach to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And the project is being done in collaboration with our Bureau of Gender Affairs with the objective of developing a gender action plan. So that's another activity that we're looking at in terms of scaling. And as I said, scaling can be from the ground in terms of involving much more groups so that they have a say in what is taking place. We're looking as well as a global fund for coral reefs investment window. And this particular fund is to train the staff of all the protected fisheries reserves around Jamaica in superior method of coral reef restoration, fisheries habitat regeneration, sustainable mariculture, and recycling of nutrients on land to prevent the killing of coral reefs. And there is an activity, I would say, that is important to us because oftentimes we are doing many activities, but we're not doing monitoring and evaluation. We're not mapping what we're doing. We're not seeing the impacts and we're not having the lessons learned. And so there is an activity that is being undertaken by us to map that sort of activity. And it's going to be on a regional basis where we will look at the climate finance that's flowing in Jamaica and the region to see how effective it is. So in looking at that, then we will be able to see where we need to go, the areas we need to tackle, and of course the lessons that are learned from the activities. So we are also looking now for Jamaica, we're looking at updating our country program, of course. And as you know, the country program is a living document. and it is iterative, and we're actually looking at a readiness grant from the GCF in order to upgrade our country program. From the Jamaica Social Investment perspective, having been accredited in order to actually access the funds and access it in a more effective way to help with the implementation, the monitoring and evaluation, we're also seeking a readiness grant from the GCF to assist us in our governance structure and in our I would say in our project planning, implementation, and for sustainability. So those are the few things that I'd like to share. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and congratulations on accreditation. Exciting, and everything that you've just done. Just to build off 3 words, 2 from Soji, partnership, learning, and Abdullah, what you were talking about in terms of action. I'm Jacqueline Novogratz, and I run Acumen, which is a nonprofit venture fund that has also created a number of for-profit funds in partnership with Green Climate Fund. And so I thought I would just go through 3 in terms of the why of them and some of the blended finance, because I do believe that with the help of some of the people in this room, Green Climate Fund has really established itself as one of the most innovative partners, the kinds of partnerships we really need if we are going to innovate and scale and get the right kind of capital to the right kind of entrepreneurs. We'd been working in the area of off-grid energy since 2006, all with philanthropic backed capital, so that we could take the very early stage risk in energy companies that were trying to find ways to bring clean energy to very, very low income communities. After 10 years of doing that and building a market that had never existed before, we came to GCF with this idea for a for-profit impact fund that turned into Kawisafi, a $70 million for-profit fund that would then scale these companies and help build on energy access to start to create the energy ecosystem. That was 2017. About 100 million people have since gotten access to off-grid light and electricity. And what we had dreamed then was that ecosystem would start to develop. And frankly, it's starting. I'm very impatient, but 5 years, and we've now invested in financing companies and interoperability companies, and are about to make an investment in an electric motorcycle company, all in East Africa, primarily Kenya and Rwanda. That then helped us start to think about beyond electricity in the agriculture space, particularly when you're looking at smallholders. We represent about 570 million people who get about 1.7% of all climate finance, despite the fact that they create 30% of our food. The reality of agriculture financing for smallholders is it's really hard. And with the climate events that we're seeing, you're not going to make a huge amount of money. And so worked with GCF to think about how would you structure a fund that protected downside risk, recognizing that your upsides might also be limited. And so GCF gave Acumen a 50% first loss guarantee, so we could crowd in more traditional private sector capital on top of that and have a $58 million fund that has invested in things like expanding a chicken farm aggregator that already has impacted 20 million people, a biodigester company, which is incredibly cool, but I think will also have real implications for how we use methane, both for liquid fertilizer as well as to heat homes, and etc. Third was during the crisis of the pandemic when it came to energy companies, because across Africa you started to see 30% of all of the early stage companies, particularly those that were run by locals, collapsing. And so GCF anchored a $90 million concessionary debt fund, which again was extremely almost radical in terms of the kinds of institutions that were coming in and willing to either give grants or take 1% interest in service of an emergency. Now we're talking about three other different facilities. One is to build on the work of Kawisafi, the first energy access, to look at that next stage. Now that the ecosystem is building, how do you actually help create green pathways out of poverty? The second is in Pakistan. How do you take the learning of working with smallholder farmers in a more productive way into a country in Pakistan where we've also been working for 20 years? And the third is perhaps the most ambitious that we have yet. And at a conference that's so focused on mitigation and now, thankfully, adaptation. Sometimes when we talk about the poorest and the most vulnerable, which is where acumen starts, people say, well, why are you worried about energy access? Is that really about climate? And it's so short-sighted if we think that the answer is no. The answer has to be yes, one, from a justice perspective. As the world gets increasingly unequal, we have 800 million people who still have no access. Two, because if Africa stays on the trajectory that it is on, in terms of the mix of fossil fuels and clean, by 2050, it will emit more carbon than China and India combined. So this is about a future mitigation. It's a moral issue as well. Of those 800 million, 215 million people are not going to be reached by markets as usual. They exist in 22 sub-Saharan African countries, none of which have more than a 45% electrification rate. Some, like South Sudan, have a 2%. Liberia, 11%. Chad, 4%. And very, very high unemployment rates. And so we're now looking at a facility that will have a $50 million philanthropy component to build markets, which is what we learned to do in our first 20 years. And then a side-by-side debt facility where we're discussing with GCF what it would look like to take first loss again so we can bring in commercial capital above that. What's so exciting to me is I don't think these kinds of facilities would have been possible 7, 8 years ago. It's also exciting to have a true partnership where you're co-creating and building. And I love what you said, and you said, it's going to take all of us. We need to find ways to build facilities that have places for different types of actors to provide what they provide best so that we can build capability, get capital to where it's most needed, and be realistic about what will actually lead to success. So I just am a huge fan of this institution. Deep, deep thanks, Soji and team, for everything that you all have done, and have never felt more urgently that this is the moment for all of us to just take risk and move.
I'm going to take exactly where my co-panelists have gone and emphasize it even further. I think today, I'm not sure if there's a more progressively disruptive partner than the GCF. Unlike some of their other multilateral partners that are constrained for a variety of institutional reasons, the GCF is mandated to sit in between where the global north has both resources and at least acquired technology, and the demands, extensive and reasonable, of the global south. And marrying the two of them, which is often politically delicate, is exactly where the GCF sits. As Soji said, MUFG is both Japan's largest bank, and as well, we are one of the GCF's most active accredited entities. Today, we're talking about a new project that we are in the midst of developing with the GCF, and being pushed by the GCF, I would say, to own and embrace not only the private sector facility that's being represented here, but even the full updating of the global strategy of the GCF, with the paradigm shift as a capping objective, but within that, a sub-objective of scaling, replicability, and sustainability in all projects. So what we are putting forward here is scaling up with private sector participants and philanthropic participants, not just a scaling up of financing, which is a familiar theme, and which, as Jacqueline has noted, can be done at a number of different levels, But I would put forward to you the real interest here is engaging private sector actors as proactive impact partners as well. Make them agile, oblige them, and by the them, I include MUFG here, to go into countries they don't normally go into. I will tell you, for a number of LDCs and SIDS, the bank's formal credit appetite for clean risk is $5. So as big as we are, and we're the biggest project finance bank in the world, we don't go into a lot of vulnerable countries. We also, as much as we do water business, renewable energy, we're the largest financer of wind power, we don't go into adaptation projects. We don't go into some of the newer areas that are being discussed every minute of this conference. So the question is, how do you do that? And so we are taking an approach, which is a portfolio approach, to put the GCF money in a subordinated role to credit enhance a very large scale portfolio. This is a debt fund that we're putting together with government partners, commercial banks, including ourselves, one of the world's largest pension funds, and two of the largest global philanthropies. So it's an interesting packaging together of different partners, as colleagues have said, that have different elements of additionality that their missions are comfortable with, but again, pushing us to places we don't normally go. And it's exactly the gift of the GCF. The ambition here, and the fund itself is big. It hopefully will come in around $1.25 billion in total. But to go into 25 countries worldwide, 30% of that portfolio, again, we're pushed by the GCF happily. 30% will go into LDCs and SIDS. 70% will go into adaptation. It's an interesting challenge. If you look where private sector money tends to go in adaptation worldwide today, you see two sectors: the water sector and waste management, largely in middle-income jurisdictions, larger cities and regions. But the push here is to go beyond that. I have no doubt we will do water projects and waste management projects worldwide, but the objective is to go further. Sustainable ag, go into coastal rehabilitation of regions that have been destroyed by illegal mining. There's a long list of things here. And the GCF has encouraged us to think broadly. But to do that, to go really and to take the money into adaptation spaces, you need a lot of project preparation. This is a lot of untested areas. So incorporated into a holistic vision, and I will appreciate a colleague from Jamaica talking about the holistic notion of scalability. It's not just the money. It's how you're able to move with the money into new spaces. So there'll be a technical assistance and project preparation facility incorporated. So you think of the whole life cycle of a project. The platform will include TA, last mile project preparation facilities, the financing structure, as I've said, and built with the flexibility, again thanks to the GCF, to lend in local currency out to 15 years. I assure you, people like us don't lend in local currency in every single one of these 25 countries out to 15 years. So we're pushed to be more sensitive, more impact focused, and equally, and this is the last point, to be locally anchored. Because there's a web of about 20 local institutions across a number of these countries that we're obliged to originate through. These projects are hard. These are not big projects that we will have to discover. And I think it's one of the great subversive elements of the GCF. Again, because the objective here is to push people like us into new directions, to use scarce public money to get maximum additionality, both financial additionality for scale. We leverage up their relatively modest contribution into a big number, but also to leverage up in terms of impact, to make us agile and to push us into new areas that are relevant today, particularly in the context of a COP graciously held by the Egyptian government. Thank you.
Does this work? I think it does. Thanks. So first, thanks very much, GCF, for the invitation to be on this panel, and what an honour it is to be amongst such an inspiring panel. And I've learnt a lot just by mingling over there with my colleagues here on the panel. So Macquarie Group is an investment bank, Australian investment bank, focused on infrastructure and energy as maybe its stronger things. We're the largest infrastructure funds manager in the world. And within that infrastructure funds management business, Green Investment Group, the business I lead, is our renewable energy investing and developing arm. We're actually the result of, we're a very mission-driven organisation. We're the merger of the renewables business I used to lead within Macquarie, and we bought the UK government's Green Investment Bank 5 years ago. And with that, we bought their mission, which we've cheerfully held on to, and to accelerate the transition to net zero. So I guess unusually for a private sector entity, we hold that as our reason why we come to work. In executing that mission, we're across all the different forms of renewable investing that we see. So onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, battery storage, hydrogen, biogases, e-mobility. And we have about 20 gigawatts of generation and other assets that we've funded already around the world, made happen. We're an equity sponsor and a developer. And we've got 70 gigawatts in our development pipeline. I have ringing in my ears Abdullah's words. What was it? Gigawatts of talk and net zero action. I'm gonna keep that one if that's okay, Abdullah. I like it. I think you won't be surprised to know that overwhelmingly all those gigawatts I just talked about are in developed markets, although I'm going to talk about emerging markets as well. And there is a real possibility of a discontinuity here, a gap. A lot is happening in the developed markets, and so many good things happening that draw us in the right direction. I will tell you that there are more corporates wanting the green electrons that we make than we can produce. Imagine that. Private companies in the developed world are desperate to have green electrons and willing to pay for it. So a whole lot of great things going on there, and maybe we've got past net zero action there. But now we must turn our attention to having impact in the markets that maybe aren't yet connected with those forces as strongly. We're busy in Brazil, Vietnam, Taiwan, and India, and I want to come to India, and keen to find our way into new markets. It's a very desirable thing for us to find our way into new markets, but sometimes we need help. Now, in some markets, and Brazil and India are both examples of this, our entry into those markets has been accelerated by the fact that private companies, again, have drawn us into that market. In Brazil, there's a big aluminium smelting company that we've worked with around the world that has a very substantial operation in Brazil and wanted us to come there to build some onshore wind with them so that they could be producing aluminium or aluminum, as I think non-Australians call it, with green electricity. And we're building a very large onshore wind farm there. So and doing that in a way that it becomes more investable to us than maybe Brazil itself would be. So very substantial project, and we've got a big pipeline of things that we want to do in Brazil. Similar things happening in India for us, where we do a lot of solar private wire, we call it, to deliver power to the big FANG companies, the Amazon Wireless Services of this world, and doing that at scale. So some things we can make happen on our own, but there are some things where we need help to make a market accessible for us. And our fantastic collaboration with the GCF in Indian mobility, particularly bus and fleet mobility, is a wonderful example of this kind of collaboration. GCF have committed $200 million of funded first loss equity to a scheme that will see us committing a matching $205 million of equity and raising debt to take us out to more than $1.5 billion, so that we can enable the very admirable nationwide mandated objectives for e-mobility in India. that's a lot of investment that's got to happen, and it's got to be delivered at a certain scale. So our mission here is to create a finance company, essentially, to take that commitment from GCF and the matching commitment that we have, and build a finance company, and that's where we are at the moment. We hope that 1.5 billion will become a number in the rear-view mirror very quickly. That with that scale to start off with, that this thing will have its own momentum and grow without much further support to be an enormous contributor to the transformation into electric vehicles in India. The task we have right now is the task that I do want to draw attention to. We have skills within our company in owning these kinds of businesses and running these kinds of businesses, but here we are creating a whole new one. That means we need to recruit the talent in India, a good thing. So we'll be creating within India the finance company that will enable this scheme to be played out. And I just want to highlight that, as is always the case, expertise and know-how becomes the critical constraining factor in making any of this stuff happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists, Mark, Christopher, Jacqueline, Keslin, Abdullah. I think we've heard kind of a broad range of some of the challenges and some opportunities that our partners have done. But I think it's not, if we distill it down, ultimately, what is all this about? We're all here for COP, we're all here for climate impact, but ultimately, what is it about? And from our perspective, it's about economic growth, it's about poverty alleviation, and it's about environmental benefits. So it's not, one of the challenges that a lot of people kind of misconstrue is that we're all here and we're all talking about climate, so but they don't see any kind of direct opportunities, direct links in terms of where the money and the funding is going and how it's impacting on people. But beyond just the climate impact that we as an organization focus on, I think we have to look at the broader impact. And I think the poverty alleviation aspect is key, and about economic development and opportunities, etc., is without doubt. Having said all that, you've heard a lot from myself and from the panelists. I'd like to make this an interactive session. So if you have questions, can you please ask them? Okay, fantastic.
Thank you very much. That was really quite exciting. This is not my normal world. I work in the health sector. I work for the WHO. I lead the specialized office on environment and health based in the Republic of Korea. And I sat here listening to you, and I was getting excited by the second, thinking about what I've heard several times today. The climate crisis is a health crisis, is a development challenge. And one of the things that people are going to feel palpably when climate really hits us is that people are going to be malnourished, impoverished, and might even die from illness. Now, we have a large amount of population, estimated about 1 billion, that have no access to healthcare facilities with energy, no water and sanitation facilities. That immediately compounds the healthcare issues that many countries have. National governments are main financiers of health in most parts of the world. They're struggling with, coping with the health, challenges. And I'm hearing this innovative, interesting ways in which you could get money into a system, get the private sector to catalyze action. And I kind of wonder, is there an avenue to bring that to focus on specific development sectors like health, like education, to get sustainably green energy, sustainable water and sanitation infrastructure into those places, especially with the market failure that surrounds many of these sectors, because they are not profitable sectors in the main in terms of cash, but they are profitable sectors in terms of human development. So I kind of just wonder, where will be the starting point and how do we do this? Thanks.
Thank you. If I could respond to the question, which I welcome, because it's at the heart of the question, thinking of the objective we are trying to promote here, to bring large-scale institutions into smaller communities, into sectors which could be water, or it could be green buildings, green infrastructure, sustainable hospitals with kit that has less carbon requirements. I, the quality of information, to begin with, is not very good. It's not very good not only about climate impact, about the catchment area of beneficiaries, and the manner in which adaptation projects transform not only the perennity of human life and labor capabilities, but very practically, to talk in boring terms, in public finance terms. It's hard for ministries of finance to allocate monies to these projects. And I think part of the TA that I talked about in our own project, the challenge, if you, such an interesting point, I got cut off. If you can measure it, you can finance it. And therefore, the question of the appreciation of land values, the appreciation of the tax base, the appreciation eventually of labor hiring, again, you get into the boring elements of how the Treasury works, but in order for monies to be allocated, you have to develop these schemes. You can come up with proxies. If you're going to work on coral reefs, then you have the hotels that ring the bay, charge a fee. This is familiar work for people working in national parks, and but that logic has to be extended. And I think that's why your question is right on, and it's part of the burden. It's not the money. I mean, the money's part of it, but again, it's capturing value so that governments can understand how to own eventually. And in theory, you could do this on a PPP basis eventually if your information quality is good enough.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, as I listen to what you're saying, I think of the organization for which I work, which is Jamaica Social Investment Fund. And I think when we think about climate change, I think we're always thinking about the environmental impact and we don't think about the holistic impact on societies. And so, if I share about Jamaica Social Investment Fund, we bring access to the most vulnerable communities. And part of our mantra is actually appealing to the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable persons. So, I hear mention about sanitation. For example, even in some schools in Jamaica, we didn't have indoor plumbing or for the schools. And so we launched our entire sanitation projects to eliminate those schools without sanitation facilities. So we are actually funded by many multinationals, and the work that we do is about social investment and bringing access to persons, bringing access to education facilities, health facilities, bringing access through social intervention in terms of parenting, just things that will help them to better the space that they're in. We're also about protecting livelihoods, right? Because oftentimes livelihoods are impacted, and many of our projects that we do and interventions that we do is about ensuring that livelihoods are protected. So the projects that we would be looking at, for example, would look at not only adaptation, mitigation, because we have persons still who use charcoal for wood. And if we're talking about even energizing that community, as an example that I shared at a different forum, is that you'd energize the community with green energy. The trees obviously are protected. The persons who are market vendors and the persons who sell on the store, they'll be able to they'll have access to transportation. So you have to look at the entire community and the space. And so sometimes investment tend to look at bigger opportunities rather than looking at the community and how the community, one community at a time, as far as I'm concerned, will actually help to transform. And I think that's where sometimes, unfortunately, I hear my colleagues from MUG, they're speaking, and there are big banks and so forth, and it's difficult to move into new spaces. But if we do not have social investment, if we do not have social development for the communities, that is going to be a challenge, because we're talking about the most vulnerable of the SIDS and so forth. Those persons are the most vulnerable. And so we actually have to ensure that whatever we are doing is aimed, and some of the things that are aimed, even though we're at the national level, some of those activities are aimed at the community level as well. And that's where Jamaica social investment comes in, and where the Jamaica, I would say, map in approaching Green Climate Fund comes in, where we look at it from the community level, and then we have another national entity that looking at it from the large public sector infrastructure perspective, and of course the other would look at it from the private sector engagement. So it has to be, we have to create the ways for communities to benefit from what we're doing. Thank you.
I guess the third answer to the same question is an overkill, but let me take a shot at it. Some people ask us, are you, are you aiming for returns, or are you a developmental fund? And the answer is always yes. For you to be a developmental fund, you need to have the right returns, because that development needs to be sustainable development. You can't keep funding something forever without a return. That's not sustainable. So I'll give you an example of something we've done with education. We looked at what part of education we need to support, and we figured out that middle income education is where we need to participate. And we went to different developers and said, why don't you develop more education for the middle income? Said, well, the land is priced right. It's priced as residential. So a lot of land from the government that was completely unutilized, priced it as education, came with it in kind. So developers we use unutilized resources. Again, it's sustainable. That's the way you need to form, whether it's education, it needs to be sustainable, profitable. You get permanent sustainability.
Just very quickly to add, because they've been so great, but I would think about two things. One is the social determinants of healthcare, which are so critical, and to actually talk to funders in a way that doesn't silo climate and health as two separate things. And so there's a whole narrative there that we've really learned so much about, whether it's reducing, to your point, indoor smoke, etc., sanitation being so connected to it. There are models that we have found in healthcare and in education that are profitable, almost always in partnership with government. And I think we also have to be honest about where there are market failures, and not try to turn them into something else, because often the poor and the vulnerable get behind when we do. And so what excites me is to find those role models anywhere in the world, where they often start with the social enterprise that have gone where government has failed, build out a blueprint, and then partner with government, and that's where you start to see the scale up. It's a slightly different model, but I think there's just so much opportunity there, and particularly in the case of climate, it's in that intersection that is so connected to the social determinants from our history. But love what you're doing.
Okay, so I'll add to that. Okay, if we take a couple of steps back, I think we need to, when you look at infrastructure, etc., right, which health is regarded as part of infrastructure. You have social infrastructure, you have regulated infrastructure, and then you have like private sector infrastructure. Social infrastructure are things like schools, utilities, etc., roads. Then you've got the regulated, in terms of like telco, roads as well, in terms of PPPs. And then you've got some like things like ports, airports, which can be fully concessioned. The reason for saying all that is this. At the end of the day, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of what are investors looking for. Private sector investors are looking for, quote unquote, profit maximization. Whereas in terms of the education and health, it's about human development. which is a trade-off between, in terms of those two goals. So that's where the challenge is. Having said all that, I know in certain countries in Africa, specifically in relation to health, right? We have what we call OPP, out-of-pocket expenditure. The reality is that in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Senegal, in the Gambia, the government expenditure, for health equates to, for example, in Nigeria, in 2019, 2020, about $79 per capita, as in per person, in terms of healthcare expenditure. In Ghana, it's about 89. In Gambia and Senegal, it's about 40, right? The vast majority of health expenditure in most of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, about 90 to 92% is out-of-pocket expenditure by individuals themselves. The reason and the impact of that is that things like insurance don't work. Why? Because for a lot of the consumers, the thought of providing or spending money on insurance is a financial loss if they do not utilize it. Right? You've also got to understand that in many parts of the developing world, you have a very youthful population. So the need for health is not perceived as being high, but in actuality, it is very high. But the point is, people do not spend, they don't invest in it. They don't invest it at the point of need when they need to do it. So you have what they call catastrophic expenditure on health. A lot of it leads to poverty, because when people need it, they will look around if they've got savings. Otherwise, they'll run around and get family, friends to contribute, because they need it at that particular time, at that point, at the point of need. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing. In terms of your question, however, what are we doing? The reality, I'll be honest with you, those are areas that we're looking at. In terms of possibility of kind of insurance, as in you typically have to provide some kind of a grant upfront to create a pool of capital that will enable the creation of insurance and reinsurance. But the point is, you also want individuals and consumers to provide what we call skin in the game. It's not necessarily a huge amount, but the point is for them to make maybe equivalent like $5-10 per month in terms of contribution. Beyond that, also, I think we also have to separate where the need is. You have most healthcare kind of demand comes at the GP level, general practice. So it's called primary care, right? About roughly 70 to 80% in sub-Saharan Africa of healthcare needs can be taken care of at the GP. I don't know what they call it in the States, but in the UK and the rest, GP, where you could go to a clinic, you're not necessarily admitted, so a lot of those can be resolved at that point. But you have secondary and tertiary, healthcare in terms of kind of more deep-seated illnesses and non-communicable diseases, etc. So I think there are possible solutions, but it also needs commitment from the government. There's only so much that the private sector can do, and truth be told, this private sector is also looking at the profit aspect. So those are some of the challenges. But I think yes, without a doubt, we need to be looking more. We need to be looking at potential financial instruments, like insurance, like consumers, contributing in small amounts at what we call kind of the social pool of insurance. I don't pretend to have all the solutions, but I think those are some of the considerations that need to happen. But it cannot be done without commitment from the government. And in some jurisdictions, in some countries, those are challenges that we're facing. So, yeah. I recognize, obviously, we've kind of galvanized you guys, so there are a lot of questions, but unfortunately, we only have another like 5 minutes, so if we can make it quick, and I apologize because I took a lot of time. So.
Thank you very much. My name's Will Steele. I'm here with the Commonwealth Youth for Sustainable Urbanisation Initiative and also the Commonwealth Sustainable Cities Initiative. And then in my spare time, I'm a principal planning consultant for Atkins. So my question concerns the spatial dimension. Do you think there needs to be a clearer and a more coordinated spatial dimension at different spatial scales to show where the infrastructure investments needed, where the development sites are, where there's local and political support? And do you think that this could really help to tackle the risks around upfront investment?
Hi from me as well. My name is Evangelos Pastas. I'm from Greece, but I've been working in the UK energy storage industry. So I deal with lithium-ion batteries, which are capital-intensive projects, but we know they're critical for the energy transition. My question is around uncertainty and how do you deal with uncertainty when you approach investors? Like Jacqueline mentioned earlier, when you're trying to create a market that's not there beforehand, your forecast can only be that good. But like you said, returns matter. When you talk numbers, you need to be specific and you need to be exact. So as a young person trying to take my first steps in business, how do I deal with that uncertainty, trying to enter new markets? And how do I deal with it as a young person, young entrepreneur specifically? That's my question. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take one final one.
Thank you very much. My name is Hubert Rizibiza. My question will go especially to Macquarie, but not too different than the other questions. How through your, and I'm a big fan of the move from the UK Green Bank to the Macquarie, so I know. So how through your funds are you somehow mitigating risk at the policy level, at regulatory level, especially in the e-mobility space, the electric vehicles? I'm not quite sure how India is in terms of their regulatory or policy for electric vehicles, but why that destination? And if there's another destination, once you recoup on your investments, which destination will it be? Thank you.
So I'll respond to this question because it's freshest in my mind. So look, we don't feel constrained by how many countries we can be exposed to at once. Like everything, we're constrained by human capital. How many people I have in my team who can be creating one new good investment after another new good investment. We do have very clear policy signals in India and in a number of countries about electrification of transport. And these policy signals are enormously important to us. They give us the confidence, and whether it's e-mobility or building out offshore wind in Taiwan or Korea or Vietnam, having that strong policy signal gives us the confidence to commit to those markets and to take risk in response to this gentleman's question. We are willing to take, and there's a discontinuity here between development stage risk, when we're spending the money and the time and the human resource to hopefully create a project that people like my colleague from MUFG and I can then invest in it and start building the big step up in capex. And we will take a lot of risk in that development phase, the phase where we're finding out whether there's a project to execute. When it comes time to press the button and start actually building it, we need to know a lot about all of the variables that will influence us to be confident that this thing can be built on price, on time, and that once it's there, we will get the revenues that we need to have. We've just created this week a global battery storage business called EQ, and it's active in Australia, UK, but also Japan and Taiwan. And there's lots of uncertainty, as you know, just inherently in a battery business case. But we've brought the science and the expertise to feel confident that we can understand it. We need to have some science there to give us the confidence. And where we don't have science, or where there are elements in the equation that we can't fully get our head around, then nimble support from the GCF, as they're giving on our e-mobility plan in India, help us bridge that lack of confidence, that lack of certainty, and can draw us out to invest. And it's a beautiful example of how GCF can work with people like us to make billions of dollars of investment happen, and a whole new business platform exists in India.
I think I'll honor the second question. I suspect the third question will get picked up further down the line. I think the question of the spatial understanding of both the placement, and I'm talking about social infrastructure investments, in some middle income cities and jurisdictions, let's say in Southeast Asia, the notion of smart cities is quite well integrated. Now, the smart city notion, of course, you have a sense of digitalization as being critical, but it's about how to support efficient, relatively low carbon solutions across a spatial area that's coherent, so that planners can ensure it's really a planning exercise. Of course, technology plugs in, but it's where the planners come to the fore. I would add, in maybe a broader range of jurisdictions, including more vulnerable countries, countries that have national adaptation plans, it's precisely the notion of how to site social infrastructure, taking care to avoid floodplains, get a sense of where future demographic concentrations will sit, how will the evolution of the requirements of social infrastructure change with changing climatic and human movements in response to these changes. I think it's the heart of a lot of the intelligent work that's being done, and we need that mapping in order to, frankly, invest intelligently, in order to stand up to the challenges that we're discussing here. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, and I will respond to you in terms of the early stage. Number one, it depends on what you mean by market creating, because when we first started in off-grid solar, we didn't even understand that we were creating a market. What we did learn very quickly was that people were very poor, they had no financing, they didn't trust off-grid solar, there was no distribution, there were diesel mafias and kerosene mafias that saw it in their interest to not allow these companies to succeed, and there was a lot of bureaucracy, corruption, and complacency. And so the idea of patient capital for us, why we needed philanthropic money so that we could take 10 to 15 year bets and accompany these entrepreneurs, and interestingly use our social capital, not just our financial capital, our access to networks, to corporations, to grants, because these companies, when they first start out building markets that have never existed before, are going to fail, and they have to be able to get up and start again, and they don't have networks of their own. And that's particularly true right now in so many of the least development companies, where we could do so much more. It is where GCF has allowed that kind of flexibility. What I didn't say is, in the way that we've structured our last three funds, is there's always a technical assistant component. And when we use the word technical assistance, particularly if you're my age, it can feel way too archaic. This is really about get the entrepreneur what they need. If it's build a CRM system, help them build the CRM system. It's really put in the pieces around that entrepreneur so that they have the capability to compete. And this is the way we need to be thinking more. In terms of uncertainty about the future, any investor here will tell you that the rule of thumb is, no matter what a young entrepreneur tells us, or an old entrepreneur at the beginning, we just cut in half what they have projected and assume that even that is probably too ambitious for what they're actually going to achieve. And if you can still decide that you want to invest after you've done that, make the investment.
Thanks. So I think the first question speaks a lot to, and I believe it was mentioned earlier about project preparation. And I think the approach to investment has to be based as well, or a large part of it has to be based on evidence. Okay, we have to support our investment via evidence, and we have to take the time. Someone mentioned mapping. We have to take the time to ensure that we have the right data in order to have the most impact. And I think that, we're trying to burn the candle at both sides. Is that what it's called? But so we want to do activities, but we have to also make sure that we're balancing it with ensuring that the right type of investment, the right type of knowledge is there to make the investment. And I think that's where the technical assistance comes from as well. A friend of mine said that social investment really is not the forte of development banks. Social investment really is a prerogative of the government, but perhaps corporate social responsibility from those banks as well could assist in providing some TAs for grants, and not for loans as well, but for grants, in order for us to make the necessary investments that we need in the areas that we need. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
In the interest of time, just relate 30 seconds in relation to the spatial aspect. I think the reality is, data is key. Even for us, we don't have just the normal functioning CRS system is somewhat of a challenge. When I came on board, one of the things I wanted us to do is use the analytics, data analytics, not just for kind of day-to-day reporting, but actually in terms of predictions or predictive analytics, in terms of portfolio management, in terms of deal origination, and in your particular case, I think in relation to identifying kind of local challenges and what I call clusters, opportunities to create clusters, which creates economies of scale, right? The idea is, so whatever solutions you want to put in place, you need to be effective, and you need to ensure that you optimize the limited resource that you have. And in our particular case, it's funding. So the ability to look at kind of economies of scale, clustering, where you can bring different industries, players together, is absolutely key. I don't want to go more into detail of that, but within GCF, I'm actually pushing for us to use analytics, as I said, not just for kind of backward-looking reporting, but also in terms of predictive analytics. In the interest of time, I know that we've gone overboard, and first of all, I'd like to thank you all. You've been very active, and your questions have been very insightful. So very much grateful for your contributions. And equally important, I'd like to thank the panels, Abdullah, Keslin, Jacqueline, Christopher, Mark. Thank you very much for your contributions, and I hope that you learnt a little bit. I certainly learnt a lot. Thank you.